We're going to be talking about a few of the new functional pseudo-class selectors in CSS. In this exercise, we will specifically be working with is and where. Pseudo-class selectors are a type of CSS selector that allow you to target specific elements based on their state or position in the document tree. These selectors always start with a colon, and they're followed by a functional expression that specifies the criteria for selecting the elements. Is a pseudo-class that allows you to group together several selectors under one parent selector. It allows you to simplify the syntax by allowing you to list multiple selectors in a single line of code. The is selector is also known as the matches any pseudo-class. We'll also be looking at the where pseudo-class selector. This is similar to is, but it does not affect the specificity of the selectors. Once again, it's going to be used to group together several selectors under one parent. So it works just like is, but it does not increase the specificity of the combined selectors. When you use where, the specificity is always 0. Where is also known as the matches any pseudo-class. Let's take a look at how we can use these in an exercise. Here's the file that we'll be working with, and I'll just quickly go through my HTML. It is worth mentioning that I'm loading a Google font, I'm loading Font Awesome, and my own custom style sheet. In regard to the HTML, I have a main element, and it's wrapping around a number of articles. They all have classes of card. Some of the articles have images, and some of them will have a div with a class of card content, along with H1, H2, and a paragraph. And then other cards do not have an image, and they also do not have the card content div. Some of them just have H2s, and some of them will only have H1s. In addition, I have some of the articles that are using a Font Awesome icon, along with either H1s or H1s and H2s. My starting CSS contains several variables for colors that I'm using. I'm zeroing out my margin and padding and adding a box sizing of border box. I have some rules on my body. I have some general rules on H1, H2, and paragraph, and I am using the clamp function that we covered earlier in this section of the course. I have a rule on main, and I'm using grid. I'm using grid template columns, and I'm creating a 3-column grid. Main also has a min width of 1200 pixels or 90%. And then I have some basic rules on my cards. I'm just setting the background color, a box shadow, and a border radius. On the card image, I am assigning a max width of 50%, a height of auto, object fit of cover, and border radius. And some of my cards have links, and I just have removed the text decoration, set the color, and I am using display flex and align items, and you'll see why I'm using this shortly. I have a generic rule for images that make them responsive, but of course this rule is more specific, so it's overriding the max width of 100%. And then I have a rule for my Font Awesome elements, and this is just sizing them, setting their color, and setting a text shadow. Before we get into using is and where, we're going to add some other pseudo-class elements that you're probably already familiar with. I'll begin by making a rule for my card links, and I'm going to use the hover pseudo-class. All I'm going to be doing here is specifying a color for hover. The other thing that I'm going to do is on the links that I have, I want to add a Font Awesome icon to the right. We're going to add a little arrow just to make these a little bit more obvious that they are links. So I'm going to target my card links, and this time I'm going to be using the pseudo-element of after. Pseudo-elements are CSS elements that allow you to insert content after an element. When we use the after selector, you can add new content to the end of an element's content. When we use the pseudo-element of after, it's going to create a virtual element that does not exist in the HTML document itself. So that means that the content and styles added by after are not part of the actual content of the element, and they do not affect the structure of the document. We'll be setting the font family to Font Awesome 6 free. We're going to set our font weight to 900. We'll set the display to be inline block. I'm going to set the padding on the left to 4 pixels and padding on the top to 2 pixels. And then finally, in regards to the actual content, we're going to use the content property. And when we want to add a Font Awesome element with CSS, we'll use the backslash, and then we'll go ahead and enter in the ASCII value for that particular element. If I save my CSS now and we reload in the browser, you'll notice that everywhere where I have a link, it should be showing our element, and clearly I have a little bit of an error in my code. I put font dash awesome for the font. It should just be font space awesome, so let me correct that. And now you can see that this icon is going to show up on my links that meet this criteria. So these are probably pseudo-elements and pseudo-classes that you have used in the past. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about is and where, which are fairly new in regards to styling elements. What we're going to do next is we're going to style these cards and make them look a little bit better. I'll go ahead and add a typical class. What I want to do is I want to target various elements that are children of my card element. So in this fashion, we would write something like article.card h1, and in this particular example, I'm going to add padding of 1 rem. If we refresh, you're going to see how these elements now have padding assigned to them. Now I actually want to apply these rules to a bunch of elements that are children of card, including H2s, paragraphs, my links, and my Font Awesome icons. Normally, if we were going to do something like this, we would create a group selector and we would target all of the elements that we want to apply this particular rule to. So our rule might look something like this. And if I save, you'll see that all of these elements are now going to take up the padding settings that we've specified. This works, but it is a lot of extra code. So what we can do is we can consolidate this down by using our is pseudo-class. Instead of writing something like this, I can replace all of this code with one selector. So I can just write article.card, then we're going to use space, is, and in parentheses, we're going to pass on the elements that meet this criteria. So in this case, I'm going to pass in H1, H2, paragraph, anchors, and the I elements. And then I'll simply open my curly braces and we'll add our padding of 1 rem. I'll just go ahead and I'll comment out this code above. If we save the CSS file and refresh in the browser, you'll see that nothing changes. So this one line of code is now doing the exact same thing. This is a great way that you can combine these selectors and really consolidate your code down and become much more succinct as you write your code. In addition to having the is selector, we also have the pseudo-class of where. And if I simply replace is with where and we refresh the page, you're going to see that no changes appear. Where really works in the same way, but it does not affect the hierarchy of the specificity in CSS. Let me show you what I mean by this. When we think of specificity in CSS, the specificity of your selectors is used to determine which rules should be applied when there are conflicting rules for the same element. The specificity of a selector is determined by the types of selectors used and the order in which they appear. When we use element selectors like this, these have the lowest specificity. If we go ahead and add a class or an attribute selector, these have a higher specificity than simply the element selectors. And then finally, ID selectors are going to have a higher specificity than class selectors and attribute selectors and even pseudo-classes. And if you were to create an inline style and apply it directly to the element, that has the highest specificity. It's important that you understand this when you're dealing with the is selector, because it can affect how the rule is going to be applied. So as I mentioned, where is not going to have any effect in regards to specificity. All of these elements are going to be considered at the 0 specificity. If we come back into our HTML and we look at one of these examples, so let's look at this article. This one has a class of card, and then you can see I have a class of card content that wraps around the H1 and the H2. So knowing that, if we were going to go ahead and make a rule for article.card H1, you will see that if we refresh the page, all of the H1s that are children of the card element are all going to turn red. If we change this though and increase the specificity, so here if we go ahead and create a similar rule, but this time I'm going to specify that I want to target the cards, and then I'm looking for something with a class of card content, and I'm looking for H1. And let's change the color here to orange. If we save now and we refresh, you're going to see that some of the H1s turn orange, and this is an example of specificity. If we were to use our where selector, and if we were to set the color of these elements to purple, and we save, you will see that all of the elements are going to turn purple except for our H1s. The H1s are using a more specific selector, so they will win out. Now, if we change the where selector to is, and we save, you will see that there is going to be no change initially, and that's because these selectors are all element selectors, so they are going to have the same level of specificity, and these elements down here have a higher level of specificity. But if we go into the is selector and we change the code inside the parentheses, here if I put .card space H1 and we save and refresh, you will see that this element is now more specific than our rule on line 66. So when we're specifying article.card and then we're using is, and in here we're passing in .card space H1, it's going to be more specific than this selector that we have right here, even though technically they're using the same selector. So even though this rule comes after this one is more specific. And this can affect other elements that you have as well. So if I go ahead and make a group selector here under my is pseudo-class and add my H2, and now let's go ahead and let's change this rule down here to H2. So if we save, you may expect that the H2s that meet this criteria are going to turn red. But when we refresh in the browser, you will see that all of the H2s turn purple, even though this selector itself is less specific than this selector right here. The reason that this is happening is because when we use the is pseudo-class selector, you're grouping the selectors together, and the specificity of the selectors is calculated based on the most specific selector within the group. If we change this back to where, and we save and refresh on the page, you're going to see that now this rule that we have on line 66 is going to kick in. So we don't have the purple H2s anymore. All of our H2s are going to be red. The reason why is because where always sets the specificity to 0. So hopefully now you understand the difference between is and where. Even though these are fairly similar selectors, they will behave differently depending on the specificity criteria. So do keep that in mind when you're working with these selectors. I really enjoy using these selectors as they decrease the amount of code that you have to write when you're working with CSS.